Early in the morning at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, one of the largest and busiest airports in the world, the air was filled with the hustle and bustle of travelers. The hurried footsteps of passengers blended with the rolling of luggage and the regular flight announcements echoing from the loudspeakers. Each passenger had their own story, their purpose for the journey. Amid the chaos, the faint light filtering through the large windows created gentle waves, and the boarding passes in the hands of passengers served as keys to open the doors to their futures. But amid all the rush, no one could have predicted that an unexpected event was about to unfold, one that would change everything on today's flight. Ian and Ryland Harrington, two boys with strong builds and confident postures, were entering the first-class cabin of the plane. Both felt a mix of unfamiliarity and excitement, as this was their first time experiencing the highest class of seats on this flight. Their joy didn't just stem from the luxury of the flight, it was for a bigger reason. This flight was a reward from their father, James Harrington, CEO of one of the world's top airline companies. For Ian, a 15-year-old composed and confident boy, this was a moment marking the achievement of many years of hard study. He knew this wasn't just a regular trip. It was a recognition of his tireless efforts. Ryland, his 13-year-old younger brother, with his cheerful and playful nature, couldn't stop smiling as he sat in the soft leather seat, his bright eyes gleaming as he experienced the premium services for the first time. The two boys received their first-class tickets from their father's hands like a special gift, a reward for their academic achievements. Both couldn't hide their joy and pride as they stepped into the first-class cabin, where they would be served with exceptional care, in comfortable seats, with top-tier services. It was a dream moment for every child, and they knew that this was something not everyone could experience. Today's flight was more than just a journey in the sky. For Ian and Ryland, it was proof of their hard work and success. They had waited for this moment for a long time, and now they would enjoy everything they had rightfully earned. But then, as they settled into their seats, something unexpected happened. A figure appeared at the end of the cabin, walking into the first-class section. It was Samantha Parker, an experienced flight attendant with over 15 years in the industry, known for her strict and meticulous nature in her work. While not known for warmth, she was highly regarded for her professionalism and her uncompromising stance on the rules. As she approached Ian and Ryland, without a greeting or a smile, she stopped and began looking at the two boys, her eyes cold as if searching for a mistake. She scrutinized every detail, from their seats to their tickets, as if something were wrong. "Excuse me, are you sitting in the correct seats?" Samantha asked, her tone icy and firm. Ian looked up, slightly surprised by her sudden question. "Yes, we have first-class tickets," he answered calmly. But Samantha didn't respond immediately. She stared at the boys, her gaze filled with suspicion. Her hands lightly held their tickets and shuffled them, as if searching for a mistake, some sign that they didn't deserve to sit there. "Who are you traveling with?" she continued, her voice sharp and full of doubt. Ryland, a bit confused, replied, "We're traveling alone." Samantha didn't say anything, but kept her eyes fixed on the ticket, flipping it back and forth as though checking something. She then turned back to look at the boys and coldly stated, "I'll be right back." And then she walked away, leaving the boys in a state of bewilderment that they couldn't explain. Comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. Ian watched her walk away, a sense of unease starting to creep into his mind. "That's strange," he said quietly. Ryland sat still, his anxiety clear on his face. "She doesn't believe us," he whispered. The entire first-class cabin seemed to stop. Passengers around them began to murmur, but no one dared to speak out. The tension quickly filled the air, and then Samantha returned, this time with another crew member. Jack Turner, the head flight attendant, a tall and stern man, followed behind her. All eyes turned to the two boys. 1 second before everything changed forever, Ian and Ryland realized that they weren't just being asked to leave their seats. They were being unjustly removed, and this confrontation with unfairness wouldn't end here. The confusion in the first-class cabin grew as Samantha Parker returned, not alone, but with the presence of Jack Turner, the head flight attendant. Each of their steps seemed to drag longer than usual, not because they were slow, but because of the seriousness and tension in the air. A sudden moment had caused the entire cabin to fall silent. Passengers began to sense the shift in the atmosphere, and many quickly realized that something was amiss. Jack Turner, a large man with a cold, sharp gaze, made the air in the cabin even heavier. Unlike other flight attendants, he didn't smile or offer comforting words. Every step he took seemed like a clear message to everyone. This was not a simple incident, and everyone would witness this injustice. As Jack approached the two boys, he didn't look at them like innocent passengers, but as if they were under scrutiny, being handled. A pitiful weariness rose in Ian's chest, but he tried to maintain his composure. "You need to come with us," Jack said, his voice as hard as stone. Ian looked up, feeling as though he was facing an unreasonable attack. He didn't know what to do, but one thing he was certain of was that they were being treated unjustly. "What's going on? We have first-class tickets. This is our seat," he tried to say calmly, though confusion was overwhelming his mind. Samantha looked at Ian coldly, not responding immediately. There was no compassion in her eyes, and even less explanation. A mere nod from Jack was enough for her to signal for them to follow. "We have valid tickets. My father bought these tickets for us," Ryland, Ian's younger brother, said with some anger. He couldn't understand why things had gotten so confusing. "We just need you to follow us," Samantha continued, her words still firm and commanding. The two boys sat in silence for a moment. Their gazes met, as if trying to understand each other in this uncomfortable situation. There was no reason for them to leave, but the truth was, standing before the strictness of an experienced flight attendant like Samantha and Jack, they couldn't do anything but comply. As they stood up, a heavy feeling surrounded them. Their steps were no longer light, but those of outcasts. Every gaze in the first-class cabin followed them. Some passengers looked at them with suspicion, while others turned away, pretending not to care, but actually observing their every move. As they walked through the first-class aisle, Ian felt embarrassment and disappointment. The soft leather seats no longer provided comfort. Everything seemed insignificant. The only thing that remained in his mind was the feeling of being judged and discriminated against. Ryland, looking at the passengers along the way, felt as though he was being exposed to the gaze of the entire world. The two boys followed Samantha down the aisle, and only when they exited the first-class cabin did they finally breathe a sigh of relief from the silence outside the cabin. But soon after, a ground staff member named Claire Martin was waiting for them, waving her hand and signaling for them to move to a separate seating area. Never before had Ian and Ryland felt so alienated. They couldn't understand what was happening. Why were they being treated like this when they had valid tickets? As soon as they sat down, Ryland grabbed his phone and immediately texted their father. He didn't think such a small incident could lead to something so serious. "They made us leave our seats. We have valid tickets." Ian looked at the phone screen when he received a reply from their father. "What's the flight number?" "He won't be happy," Ian whispered, a sense of worry rising in his chest. Ryland didn't respond immediately, staying silent as he stared at the phone screen. "I can't believe it. We haven't done anything wrong." Meanwhile, inside the first-class cabin, Samantha continued with her duties. She seemed unaffected by the situation. The passengers in the cabin went on with their activities, some engrossed in books, others absent-mindedly gazing out the window. But it was those watching eyes that made the situation even more difficult for her. She didn't realize that every action she took was being observed and judged by others. Samantha didn't realize that in this cabin all eyes had already learned the story. Passengers had begun to doubt the fairness of her decision. And although she thought this was a small incident, the price would not just be an apology to Ian and Ryland, but also the consequences she would have to face. When Samantha returned to the first-class cabin after a few minutes, she noticed a clear change in the atmosphere. The passengers no longer looked at her with respect, but with scrutiny. There was a sense of something shady in their eyes, as though everyone knew this wasn't normal. Samantha couldn't avoid the realization that she had made a big mistake, one that could lead her to face unimaginable consequences. A strange and vague feeling enveloped Ian and Ryland as they sat waiting in the area far from the first-class cabin. Their eyes no longer gleamed with the joy they had at the beginning. Instead, a sense of tension and unease spread throughout their bodies. They couldn't understand what was happening. The two boys, who had always taken pride in their academic achievements, had been rewarded with a first-class flight to celebrate their efforts, yet because of a hasty decision, they were being treated as if they were undeserving of what they had earned. Ian turned to look at his younger brother. "Don't worry, Dad will sort this out. We didn't do anything wrong." But Ryland couldn't shake off the sense of injustice weighing on them. He looked down at his phone, his hand scrolling absent-mindedly across the screen. A series of messages had been sent, but no one in their family could help immediately. Everything only seemed more uncertain as Ryland felt a numbness settle in his chest. Why would she do this? She hadn't even checked the tickets properly. Why did she believe they didn't belong in first class just because they were kids traveling alone? "Dad's going to be mad," Ryland whispered. Ian didn't respond, only pressing his lips together, his mind swirling with thoughts. But he knew one thing. Not now. Not while everything was still unclear. They couldn't do anything but wait, yet the worry and disappointment gnawed at their minds. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin, Samantha continued with her duties, unaware of the shift in the atmosphere. To her, this was just a small misunderstanding. She had made her decision confidently, without letting any doubt seep into her thoughts. However, every step she took in the first-class cabin now felt like walking in a room full of suspicion. Passengers no longer looked at her with respect and trust. Their gazes had become sharper, as if everyone was looking for a reason to criticize her actions. Samantha, a longtime veteran in the airline industry with strict rules and procedures, began to feel something was off. The eyes following her, the silence from the passengers, it all seemed to point back at her. She felt uncomfortable. She was used to tense situations, but this time she couldn't ignore the unease pressing down on her. When she returned to the first-class cabin to continue her work, everything had changed. The air in the cabin was no longer as pleasant as it had been before. A quiet tension had replaced the calm atmosphere she was familiar with. Some passengers seemed to try not to look at her, but clearly they had noticed the change in her attitude. Some even turned away, as though they already knew what was happening without needing to say it. Samantha looked around, unable to ignore the gazes around her, but all she could do was continue her duties. But in her heart, doubt began to creep in. Had she done something wrong? Was this just a small misunderstanding? Should she check everything again? When Jack Turner returned to the first-class cabin, Samantha no longer felt confident. He approached her with a blank expression, his eyes filled with worry and tension. "Samantha, you need to resolve this issue as soon as possible," Jack said, his voice cold and firm, showing no signs of leniency. Samantha nodded mechanically, trying to remain calm. She couldn't have predicted that her actions would make things escalate like this. The doubt wasn't just coming from Ian and Ryland, but also from the passengers on the flight. She looked again at the two boys, their eyes full of disappointment and helplessness. Meanwhile, outside the first-class cabin, Ian and Ryland continued to wait, with nothing to do but stare out the window, feeling every passing minute, in silence. Ryland occasionally glanced down at his phone, but everything remained at a standstill. A new message from their father arrived, but there was still no clear information. "Dad's on his way," Ian read aloud, and a weak smile briefly crossed his face. Soon after, a call came in from James Harrington. Ian could tell that his father's voice deepened when he heard about the incident. "All right, don't worry," James said from the other end of the line, but his words couldn't ease the worry in Ian's heart. All he could hear was the anger in his father's voice. But one thing Ian knew for sure: this wasn't over. And now, all he could do was wait. Wait to see how the truth would unfold, and whether real justice would be served. A prolonged silence enveloped the waiting area, the noise of the airport now seeming like it belonged to another world, as Ian and Ryland sat waiting. The hard chairs beneath them no longer offered the comfort they had felt earlier. Instead, an unease grew inside them, like a dark cloud covering their minds. They had done everything right. They had tickets, they were sitting in the correct seats, and they weren't causing any trouble. Yet now they were being pushed out without a clear reason. It seemed as though everything was working against them. Ryland sat silently, occasionally looking down at his phone as if seeking some comfort. He had sent a message to their father since they were removed from first class, but everything still remained in a state of uncertainty. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Could their father resolve this quickly and fairly? Ian, also silently looking at his phone screen, let his mind drift back to the moment when Samantha and Jack had entered, demanding that they leave their seats. They were just children, and the way they were treated made Ian feel as though he had no value. But with their father, James Harrington, CEO of one of the world's largest airlines, they had the right to be protected. Ian knew that this wouldn't end here. Suddenly, the sound of a ringing phone broke the silence. Ian looked at the screen and saw his father's name appear. Without hesitation, he pressed the button to accept the call. "Dad, we've been kicked out of first class, even though we have valid tickets. She didn't even check properly, and..." Ian couldn't continue. The worry had taken over his words. James Harrington's voice came through the line, low but steady. "Don't worry, Ian. I've received the information. Where are you? Stay where you are. I'll take care of it." A strange sense of reassurance filled Ian's chest as he heard those words. He no longer felt powerless. His father, a powerful man with the ability to solve any issue, had spoken. His words were a commitment that everything would be resolved quickly and fairly. But Ian couldn't help but feel a fleeting sadness when he thought about how they had been treated. Would their father be able to restore their dignity, or would they have to live with the shame that those around them had witnessed? Meanwhile, Samantha Parker, continuing her work in the first-class cabin, seemed unaware of the tension now surrounding the flight. She had thought everything was fine. She had acted in a way that she believed was reasonable, but she had no idea that her hasty decision would lead to consequences that she could no longer control. She didn't realize that among the usual passengers, one important person was sitting in the cabin, someone who could change everything. Jack Turner, the head flight attendant, also couldn't ignore the tension in the air. He was a man who had witnessed many tense situations in his career, but this time something felt different. His anxiety didn't just come from resolving a regular issue, but from the realization that this wasn't just about the two boys. It could change not only their lives, but also his and Samantha's. When the call from the CEO came in, everything became even more serious. Jack received a call from the operations department, and when he heard the news that James Harrington, the owner of the airline, knew about the incident, he realized that the consequences would be far greater than a simple etiquette check. The feeling of dread enveloped him as he began to understand that this wasn't just a minor incident. This was a big problem, and everyone was on the verge of an inevitable crisis. Minutes later, Jack walked into the cabin, his eyes completely changed. Each step he took now carried a seriousness that words could not express. "Samantha," he called her name sternly, "you need to resolve this immediately." Samantha only nodded. She understood that she could no longer avoid it. She knew that once the CEO was involved, no one could protect her from the larger consequences. She turned, looking at the passengers who were silently observing. Although they didn't speak, everyone felt that something was off. Their curious and doubtful gazes followed her every move. Samantha at this moment realized that she couldn't just return to her duties as if nothing had happened. She walked straight to where Ian and Ryland were sitting, her heart pounding faster than ever. She knew this meeting would not be as simple as the others, and she couldn't be sure that she could escape this situation easily. The atmosphere in the cabin was no longer peaceful as it once had been. The air was heavy and tense, as though everything was waiting for an explosion. The passengers sat in silence, no longer focused on the entertainment screens. Instead, their eyes, filled with curiosity and suspicion, were directed toward the front. Everyone could sense that something serious was happening. No one spoke, but their gazes, full of unasked questions and speculation about what was going on, were like a dark cloud descending upon Samantha Parker. She couldn't help but feel this tension. Samantha walked through the cabin, but each step felt long and heavy. Her mind was empty, and the only question haunting her was, how could she salvage this situation? She had faced many tense situations in her 15 years of work, but never had she felt this way. The fear crept into every fiber of her being, and no matter how hard she tried to stay calm, the truth was, she couldn't control what was happening. As she turned back to the first-class cabin where Ian and Ryland were sitting, she felt the change in the atmosphere. The passengers no longer pretended not to know what was going on. The cabin was no longer as quiet as before. Instead, it was a silence full of tension. The gazes couldn't hide their suspicion, their judgment, and their unspoken questions. And of course, Ian and Ryland were also looking at her with eyes full of disappointment, not only because they were removed from their seats, but because of the way she had treated them, as if they didn't deserve to be there. Ian, with a calm yet angry expression, stared directly at her. "You didn't check our tickets properly. You didn't do your job." His voice was deep and clear, but each word struck her like a hard blow. Samantha swallowed, trying to keep her composure. "It was a misunderstanding. She stopped, knowing that any explanation at this point would mean nothing. She couldn't change what she had done. The guilt surged, and it felt like she was standing in front of all the people she had served over the years. Suddenly, a deep voice echoed through the cabin's PA system. "Samantha Parker, please report to the operations room immediately." The cold announcement hit her like a slap in the face. She turned to see Jack Turner, the head flight attendant with whom she had worked for many years, his face showing no words, but his eyes filled with concern. There was no time for explanations, no time for excuses. She knew this meeting with the directors would not be easy. As Samantha left the cabin, a suffocating atmosphere followed her. Every eye was on her. The passengers in the cabin were no longer indifferent. For them, what had just occurred was not just a minor incident. It was a lesson in power, in discrimination, and in how a wrong decision could destroy a person in the blink of an eye. Samantha made her way to the operations room, each step feeling heavier. When she entered, there was no greeting. The executives, including Olivia Brooks and Henry Mitchell, looked at her with cold, evaluating eyes. They had received the report, and she knew they were preparing to face her. "You made a mistake, Samantha," Henry Mitchell, one of the executives, said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "A mistake that is unforgivable." Samantha swallowed, her hands gripping each other tightly. I didn't think this was such a big mistake. I just thought that... Olivia interrupted her immediately. You didn't check the tickets properly, didn't ask anyone about the issue. You assumed they didn't belong in first class just because they were two children traveling alone, and that's the problem. You're a flight attendant with many years of experience. You should have known how to handle this situation. The guilt began to rise within Samantha. Yes, she was wrong, but not because of a failure in her work, but because she had allowed her personal biases to influence her decision. You can't just work based on assumptions like this, Olivia continued. If you can't do your job fairly, then you'll have to face the consequences. A moment of silence passed before Henry Mitchell spoke again. And this is not just a personal incident. You've harmed the airline's image. You didn't just hurt those two boys, you hurt all the other passengers, those who trust in our fairness. Samantha felt the air in the room grow thicker. She couldn't say anything. What she had done today wasn't just a minor mistake. It was a decision that had changed everything, and now she had to face the consequences. Samantha no longer had the chance to justify herself, no way to hide her mistakes. What she had done had affected not only the two boys, but also the entire airline she had served for so many years. Her actions would not be easily forgiven, and now she had to accept the truth that her life had changed forever. The atmosphere in the airline's operations room was heavier than ever. Samantha Parker stood silently before the executives, her hands clenched tightly as she tried to suppress the trembling that spread throughout her body. She could feel their cold, piercing gazes, but these looks weren't filled with concern or sympathy, only disappointment and ruthless judgment. What were you thinking when you did that? Henry Mitchell, the airline's CEO, spoke again. His voice was cold, but the disappointment in it was so clear that it couldn't be hidden. Samantha couldn't answer immediately. She wanted to argue, to say that she was just doing her job, that she was simply trying to maintain safety and order in the cabin. But she knew that any excuse at this point would be meaningless. She had made a serious mistake. She had allowed her personal biases to influence her actions, and now she had to pay the price for it. Olivia Brooks, one of the executives, continued. This isn't a normal misunderstanding. You've lost the trust of our customers and caused a shock to all the passengers on that flight. More importantly, you misjudge the people involved. We cannot accept actions like this, Samantha. Samantha felt a shiver run down her spine. These words cut deep into her heart like a knife. She had lost the trust of the people she had served for so many years. The passengers, especially the two boys, Ian and Ryland, had been hurt by her. There was no justification for her actions, and now she had to face the horrific consequences. Jack Turner, the head flight attendant, stood in the corner of the room silently observing. He had witnessed many incidents in his career, but never one so serious. He couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just Samantha's mistake. It was also a failure of the system that hadn't done its job properly. However, he knew that all the blame would fall on Samantha. She was the one responsible, and she would have to face everything. You'll need to submit a full report on this incident, Henry Mitchell continued, his voice firm and unsympathetic. A detailed report on why you made this decision and what you were thinking throughout the process. After that, you'll be held accountable for your actions before the entire board. We'll need to reassess your entire work process and determine whether you're still fit to continue in your position here. Each word from Henry felt like a heavy hammer striking Samantha's mind. She had never imagined that one wrong decision could bring her to the point of such failure. She felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, with no way to turn back. Olivia took a deep breath and then spoke again. We cannot let this go easily. We need to conduct a thorough investigation into this matter, and everything will be handled according to protocol. You need to cooperate to resolve this issue. The heavy feeling still pressed on Samantha's chest, but she knew there was no other way. She had made a mistake, and now she had to face the consequences. She nodded, her eyes filled with acceptance. She would do whatever it took to help the company understand what had happened. But would that change anything? Outside the operations room, Ian and Ryland still sat in the waiting area, their eyes glued to their phone screens. Both boys were anxious about what would happen next. Ian had received a call from their father, James Harrington, but he could do nothing but sit there waiting. "Dad won't let this go," Ian said, trying to reassure his younger brother. Ryland looked at him, his eyes full of disappointment. "We did everything right, Ian. Why do we have to go through this? Just because we're two kids?" Ian didn't answer immediately. He understood his brother's feelings. Both of them had been insulted and humiliated unfairly, but he knew that everything would be resolved soon. Their father was a man of power, and no one could overlook this injustice. "Dad will handle this, Ryland," Ian said firmly. "We didn't do anything wrong, and he'll protect us." A moment later, Ian received a message from their father. "Stay where you are." "I'm handling everything. Don't worry. You won't be held responsible for this incident." Ian sighed, feeling a sense of relief return. He knew that his father would never allow them to endure such an injustice. Everything changed in an instant. Before this event, Ian and Ryland had lived with the belief that justice was always served, and that all wrongs would be righted. But after today, that belief seemed to be severely shaken. They felt as though they were forgotten by society simply because they were children, and because of the invisible discrimination of a flight attendant. The two boys sat silently in the waiting area, their thoughts tangled in their heads. Everything was inexplicable. Why, as children who just wanted to enjoy their flight, were they treated this way? How could such a small bias disrupt their entire journey and humiliate them? "We didn't do anything wrong," Ian thought to himself. "Dad will take care of everything," he reassured himself, but the worry still haunted him. His father's voice in the previous call hadn't provided much comfort. James Harrington, though the CEO of a large airline, Ian couldn't be sure what he would do to change this situation. The people in the company might not be easily swayed. "What do you think Dad will do?" Ryland asked, his eyes fixed on Ian, his face full of concern. Ian nodded, trying to remain calm. "Dad will do whatever it takes to fix this, Ryland. We can't just sit here forever like this." But despite saying that, Ian's heart was full of worry. He knew his father had power, but would that power help them in the situation? What difficulties would his father face when intervening? And would the airline staff, including Samantha Parker, be held accountable? The two boys could do nothing but wait. Everything depended on their father and the decisions he would make. Suddenly, Ian's phone rang and a message from his father appeared on the screen. "Don't worry, I'll handle this. We won't let her get away with this." Ian sighed with relief. Just as he thought, his father wouldn't let this pass easily. But even so, he couldn't shake the unease in his heart. Would those who had wronged them truly be held accountable for their actions? Or would it all just be empty apologies with nothing changing? In the operations room, the truth began to slowly unfold. Samantha Parker was facing the airline's board of executives. She stood before the executives, including Henry Mitchell and Olivia Brooks, their eyes cold and stern. This was not a normal meeting. This was her confrontation with all the wrong she had done. Olivia Brooks spoke first. "We need a full explanation from you, Samantha. You acted inappropriately and caused significant harm to the reputation of this airline. You judge the two boys simply because of your biases, and this is unforgivable." Samantha felt breathless as she heard these words. She knew that any explanation now would be useless. What had happened couldn't be undone. All that remained were the consequences she would have to face. "We need a detailed report on this incident," Henry Mitchell said, his gaze sharp as a knife. And you will also face an investigation into your training process to see if you are still capable of working in this environment. The room fell into silence. Samantha felt everything around her spinning. She never imagined that her hasty action would lead to such a major crisis. She thought she was doing the right thing, but now she realized that she was wrong, and the consequences of her mistake wouldn't be easy to fix. Back at the airport, in the waiting area, Ian and Ryland waited for a response from their father. Time passed slowly, and the feeling of unease in both of them only grew. Everything was a mess, but they knew one thing. Their father wouldn't let everything go unanswered. It wasn't until they received a call from their father that Ian began to feel somewhat reassured. Dad spoke with the airline's executives. James Harrington's voice came through the line. She will be held responsible for her actions. We won't let this go without results. His father's words were like a tranquilizer, but Ian couldn't stop worrying. He wasn't sure that everything would be resolved smoothly. This wasn't just about a seating misunderstanding. It was about discrimination, about the flawed thoughts and attitudes people imposed on others simply because they weren't like them. The two couldn't help but think about what would happen next. Would their father's intervention be strong enough to change everything? Or would those who had hurt them escape responsibility? Both of them hoped for a fair outcome, but deep down the worry still lingered. The entire cabin had sunk into an unusual silence since Samantha Parker left. Passengers quietly continued their activities, some still engrossed in their phones, others reading magazines, but all could feel the difference in the air. No one dared speak, but their eyes kept shifting, as if they all knew something big was happening and that nothing would ever be the same again. Samantha returned to the first-class cabin after she met with the executives. She walked slowly, trying to maintain a facade of calm, but just a glance from the passengers was enough for her to realize that no one was looking at her with the same respect as before. Everything had changed. It seems like everyone already knows, she thought to herself, wondering if this was the end of a chapter in her life. As she passed the rows of seats, a few passengers' gazes followed her every step. An older woman in seat 3D looked at her with an expression of undisguised disappointment. A man in a suit in seat 4A subtly shook his head, just enough for her to see. It seemed they all knew exactly what had happened, that Samantha was wrong, that her actions hadn't just hurt the two boys, but all the passengers on the flight. And now she had to face them, no longer as a respected flight attendant, but as someone who had to take responsibility for a serious incident. Each step she took felt like it added to the weight in her heart. She knew that the next conversation wouldn't just be about an apology. She would have to pay for the mistakes she had made. Back with Ian and Ryland, the two boys sat in the waiting area, anxiety never leaving them. Each passing minute felt like an eternity, as if time had stopped in their anticipation. They could do nothing but sit in silence, occasionally checking their phones to see if there were any updates from their father. Even though they knew their father had power and wouldn't let this injustice go unaddressed, the worry inside them couldn't be quelled. "Dad's probably busy handling this," Ian said, trying to reassure Ryland, but his voice lacked full confidence. "What do you think Dad will do?" Ryland asked, his eyes filled with curiosity and anxiety. He wanted to trust his father, but the injustice they were enduring made him feel like everything was slipping out of his hands. Ian sighed. "Dad won't let this go, but—" He paused, looking down at his phone. But not everyone accepts failure so easily. Dad isn't the only one with the power to make decisions. When the call from James Harrington came through, both boys quickly answered, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Their father's voice came through clearly from the other end. "Are you both okay?" "Dad," Ian began, but stopped when he heard his father continue. "Don't worry, I've handled it. She will be held accountable. I won't let her affect you." Ian and Ryland could feel the strength in their father's voice. They didn't need to say anything more. They knew that once James Harrington had spoken, this wouldn't be over easily. "Dad will do whatever it takes to fix this," James continued. "Wait a little longer. Don't go anywhere." When the call ended, Ian and Ryland looked at each other. The stillness in their hearts slowly transformed into certainty. They weren't just waiting for a change in the company. They were waiting for recognition and justice for themselves. Back in the operations room, Samantha faced Henry Mitchell and Olivia Brooks. She knew they would never let her escape the consequences of her actions. Though an apology was necessary, it likely wouldn't be enough to restore the reputation she had lost. "Do you realize the seriousness of this situation?" Henry Mitchell spoke, his gaze sharp as a knife. Samantha tried to remain calm, but she couldn't deny that guilt had taken over her heart. "I understand," she said softly. "I'm sorry for acting hastily and incorrectly. But I did what I thought was right at the time. I didn't know they were the CEO's children." Olivia looked at her without saying anything, but her eyes were filled with understanding. "But that's not the issue, Samantha. You didn't need to know who they were. You only needed to do your job correctly. And you failed." A silence enveloped the room, and Samantha could do nothing but accept the criticism from them. She had no more words to say. Samantha realized that her career would never be the same again. Discrimination had ceased to be an invisible issue. It had now become a painful reality that she had to face. But for Ian and Ryland, this event was not just a fight for justice, but also a valuable lesson about power, discrimination, and how people sometimes don't realize their strength until they face the cruelty of society. The entire flight seemed to freeze in the heavy tension. The air in the cabin was no longer as pleasant as before. It was a silence filled with tension, like a stretched rubber band ready to snap. Ian and Ryland sat silently, looking at each other, their thoughts spiraling uncontrollably. Even though their father had promised to resolve the issue, they couldn't shake the sense of unease. Could their father do anything to restore their honor? Would Samantha be held accountable? And would the airline truly change? It had been almost an hour since the last call from their father ended. Ian held his phone, scrolling through unread messages, but there was nothing new. Ryland, sitting beside him, also stared at his phone screen. His younger brother's eyes were still filled with worry. Even though they had been reassured by their father that they would be protected, Ryland still felt uncomfortable. The discrimination they had endured didn't just affect them, it touched a part of the dignity of their whole family. "What do you think Dad will do next?" Ryland asked, his voice slightly trembling. Ian didn't respond immediately. He looked out the airplane window, the light outside doing nothing to ease the tension inside him. He felt a sense of emptiness, not because the situation was so terrible, but because of the sense of unfairness. "Dad will go meet them," Ian said. "He'll talk to the CEO and the executives. We won't just stop at an apology. Dad will do everything to make sure everyone knows what happened is unacceptable." Ryland sighed, his gaze still filled with anxiety. "But will this change anything? Or is it just going to be another investigation that amounts to nothing?" Ian looked at Ryland, feeling the exhaustion in his brother's eyes. "Dad won't let this go easily, Ryland. This isn't just about us. It's going to affect the entire company." Not long after, Ian's phone rang again, this time with an incoming call. Ian quickly answered, the anxiety rising in his chest again. James Harrington's voice came through clearly on the other end, calm yet firm. "Are you both okay?" "I've met with the executives. Everything will be resolved." Ian could feel the reassurance in his father's voice. He knew things were heading in the right direction, but he still couldn't shake the worry inside. "Dad, we want to know how she'll be held accountable, and will this change how they treat others?" James Harrington was silent for a moment, as if thinking carefully. "Rest assured she will face the consequences of her actions. But this isn't just about dealing with one individual. I'm working with the executives to make sure the training processes and the way the staff is trained are changed so that this doesn't happen again. The certainty in his father's voice made Ian feel a little lighter. He knew that this wasn't going to be as simple as just firing a flight attendant. This was an opportunity to change the wrong ideas, to make the company reflect on how they treated all passengers, especially kids like Ian and Ryland, children who had the right to be treated fairly, no matter where they came from. "Thank you, Dad," Ian said, a sense of relief flooding over him. "We know you'll do everything to make sure this is resolved. I won't let you suffer this injustice. You'll not only get justice, but I'll do everything to make sure no other passengers have to go through this," James said, his voice resolute. "I'll let you know when I have my next meeting, but don't worry, everything will be fine." The call ended, and Ian felt a huge weight lifted from his chest. Both boys could feel that things were moving in the right direction. But what about the passengers on the flight? Those who had witnessed the injustice? What would they think? Ian looked around the cabin, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The gazes that followed them were no longer filled with awkwardness, but instead with respect, as if everyone now realized that justice would ultimately be served. Meanwhile, Samantha Parker was facing the airline's executives. She walked into the meeting room no longer exuding the confidence she once had. Although she had been an excellent flight attendant, now all that remained was a feeling of guilt and regret. She had come to realize that her actions hadn't just affected Ian and Ryland, they had tarnished the reputation of the entire airline. "Ms. Parker, we've received reports from the investigators. This isn't just a personal incident. It's about training methods and communication within the company. You failed to properly check the information," Henry Mitchell said, his voice cold and full of criticism. Olivia Brooks continued, "We can't let this go without change. The training processes need to be adjusted, and Ms. Parker, you'll be held accountable for your actions." It felt like a storm was coming. Samantha could do nothing but lower her head, accepting everything. She knew that her apologies and explanations now meant nothing. Justice had been served. Samantha Parker would face the consequences of her wrong decision, but significant changes would come to the airline. Ian and Ryland finally felt that justice had been restored, and they realized that sometimes the most important thing is to never give up and always stand up for your rights. The entire flight seemed to pause under the heavy tension. The air in the cabin was no longer as comfortable as before, but rather filled with a strained silence, like a stretched rubber band ready to snap. Ian and Ryland sat silently, looking at each other, their thoughts spinning endlessly. Although their father had promised to resolve the issue, they couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Could their father do anything to restore their honor? Would Samantha be held accountable? And would the airline truly change? Almost an hour had passed since the last call from their father ended. Ian held his phone, scrolling through unread messages, but there was nothing new. Ryland, sitting next to him, also stared at his phone screen. His younger brother's eyes were still filled with worry. Even though they had received assurances from their father that they would be protected, Ryland still felt uneasy. The discrimination they had faced hadn't just affected them, but it also touched the dignity of their entire family. "What do you think Dad will do next?" Ryland asked, his voice slightly trembling. Ian didn't answer immediately. He looked out the airplane window, the light outside doing nothing to ease the tension inside him. He felt a sense of emptiness, not because the situation was so terrible, but because of the sense of unfairness. "Dad will go meet them," Ian said. "He'll talk to the CEO and the executives. We won't just stop at an apology. Dad will do everything to make sure everyone knows what happened is unacceptable." Ryland sighed, his gaze still filled with anxiety. But will this change anything, or is it just going to be another investigation that amounts to nothing? Ian looked at Ryland, feeling the exhaustion in his brother's eyes. Dad won't let this go easily, Ryland. This isn't just about us. It's going to affect the entire company. Not long after, Ian's phone rang again, this time with an incoming call. Ian quickly answered, the anxiety rising in his chest again. James Harrington's voice came through clearly on the other end, calm yet firm. "Are you both okay?" "I've met with the executives. Everything will be resolved." Ian could feel the reassurance in his father's voice. He knew things were heading in the right direction, but he still couldn't shake the worry inside. "Dad, we want to know how she'll be held accountable. And will this really change how they treat others?" James Harrington was silent for a moment, as if thinking carefully. "Rest assured she will face the consequences of her actions. But this isn't just about dealing with one individual. I'm working with the executives to make sure the training processes and the way the staff is trained are changed, so that this doesn't happen again." The certainty in his father's voice made Ian feel a little lighter. He knew that this wasn't going to be as simple as just firing a flight attendant. This was an opportunity to change the wrong ideas, to make the company reflect on how they treated all passengers, especially kids like Ian and Ryland, children who had the right to be treated fairly, no matter where they came from. "Thank you, Dad," Ian said, a sense of relief flooding over him. "We know you'll do everything to make sure this is resolved. I won't let you suffer this injustice. You'll not only get justice, but I'll do everything to make sure no other passengers have to go through this," James said, his voice resolute. "I'll let you know when I have my next meeting. But don't worry, everything will be fine." The call ended, and Ian felt a huge weight lifted from his chest. Both boys could feel that things were moving in the right direction. But what about the passengers on the flight, those who had witnessed the injustice? What would they think? Ian looked around the cabin, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The gazes that followed them were no longer filled with awkwardness, but instead with respect, as if everyone now realized that justice would ultimately be served. Meanwhile, Samantha Parker was facing the airline's executives. She walked into the meeting room, no longer exuding the confidence she once had. Although she had been an excellent flight attendant, now all that remained was a feeling of guilt and regret. She had come to realize that her actions hadn't just affected Ian and Ryland, they had tarnished the reputation of the entire airline. "Ms. Parker, we've received reports from the investigators. This isn't just a personal incident. It's about training methods and communication within the company. You failed to properly check the information," Henry Mitchell said, his voice cold and full of criticism. Olivia Brooks continued, "We can't let this go without change. The training processes need to be adjusted, and Ms. Parker, you'll be held accountable for your actions." It felt like a storm was coming. Samantha could do nothing but lower her head, accepting everything. She knew that her apologies and explanations now meant nothing. Justice had been served. Samantha Parker would face the consequences of her wrong decision, but significant changes would come to the airline. Ian and Ryland finally felt that justice had been restored, and they realized that sometimes the most important thing is to never give up and always stand up for your rights. Real-life lessons learned. Never let prejudice influence your actions. One of the most important lessons is not allowing prejudice, whether intentional or unintentional, to influence our decisions. Discrimination in any form can lead to serious consequences, not only affecting others but also ourselves. Justice is a basic right for everyone. Everyone, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated fairly. Even if you don't fully understand someone else's story, you have no right to judge them. This story reminds us that justice isn't something that can be easily overlooked. It must be protected in all circumstances. Power doesn't always align with justice. Sometimes those in power, despite their great capabilities, can still make mistakes. However, truth and justice will always prevail when we confront wrongdoing. Ian and Ryland's story shows that even as children, they can make a difference when they stand firm for what is right. Change begins with small actions. Small actions like standing up for your seat can create significant change. Even though we may sometimes feel powerless, every right action can contribute to making a difference in society. No one is too small to make a change. This story also affirms that no one is too small or insignificant to create change. No matter who you are or where you stand in society, if you act rightly and never give up, you can make a difference. Ian and Ryland prove this. They not only fought for their rights, but also helped change the way people act in the airline industry. Learn to accept mistakes and correct them. Though not easy, recognizing mistakes and correcting them is an essential part of growing. Samantha Parker faced her mistake, and though the result couldn't be immediately reversed, she still had to take responsibility for her actions. This story shows that we can only move forward and become better when we dare to face and correct our mistakes. Conclusion. This story teaches justice, perseverance, and the importance of standing up for your rights. It emphasizes that everyone can create great change, even through small actions, and that justice will always triumph if we remain determined and hold on to what is right.